America just moved to choke off China's cheap oil, not with a speech, not with another tariff headline, but by going after the two oil valves that have quietly helped keep China's production costs brutally low, Venezuela and Iran. And if you think this is some distant political drama, listen carefully. Because when cheap oil gets cut, the damage doesn't start at the wellhead. It hits the factory floor, it hits logistics, it hits consumer prices. It hits the one advantage China has used to outcompete the world for 2 decades: cost. China's edge was never just cheap labor. The deeper edge is cheaper input energy, oil that's steady, discounted, and often bought through gray channels, settled through alternative payment routes, sometimes even outside the US dollar system. That kind of supply lets refineries run cheaper. It lets diesel stay cheaper. It lets trucking and shipping stay cheaper. And when energy stays cheap long enough, the entire industrial machine can price its exports at levels Western firms can't match. So when Washington looks at China's manufacturing dominance, the question eventually stops being, what chip did they build, and becomes, what fuel keeps this machine running so cheap? That's why the strategy is shifting from tariffs to supply warfare. Venezuela is one pipeline, Iran is another, and both share the same dangerous feature from Washington's point of view. Their barrels often move through shadow networks, at deep discounts, and increasingly through settlement structures that reduce U.S. visibility and leverage. The longer that system runs, the harder it becomes to break. So the U.S. does what markets fear most. It turns risk into reality. You don't need to stop every barrel. You only need to raise the risk enough that insurers, shipping firms, intermediaries, and ports start pulling back. Because cheap oil only stays cheap when the risk is low. The moment the risk premium spikes, the discount collapses, even if the oil still exists. And when that discount collapses, China's cost advantage starts bleeding in real time. But here's the part most people miss. China won't just sit there and take it. If Washington squeezes cheap oil, Beijing has a retaliation weapon that can hit America faster and more precisely: rare earths and critical components, the material inputs the U.S. needs for electric motors, missiles, radar systems, batteries, and most importantly, the broader industrial ecosystem that supports chip production. Understand this: America designs world-class chips. But turning designs into mass output still depends on a physical supply chain, and China sits on key choke points across it. Not just raw rare earths, but the processing, the refining, the industrial magnets, the specialized materials, the subcomponents that keep manufacturing lines moving. When those inputs get tightened, the result isn't a minor delay. It's a break. And a break in inputs means production slows, orders slip, revenue compresses, layoffs rise. At the same time, scarcity pushes prices up, so inflation climbs while growth weakens. That's the nightmare macro mix, and it corner traps the Federal Reserve. The economy starts wobbling, but prices stay hot. Rates can't come down fast without risking inflation. And if rates stay higher for longer, the probability of a 2026 downturn stops being a theory and starts becoming a real scenario. This is the core storyline. The U.S. squeezes cheap oil to erode China's competitive advantage. China squeezes rare earths and components to choke American manufacturing. And the casualties aren't just governments. They're companies, workers, consumers, and markets. This is what supply war looks like. And once it starts, it doesn't stay in Venezuela or Iran. If the United States is trying to starve China's cost advantage by cutting off discounted oil, Beijing doesn't need to win in the Middle East to respond. It can strike the American economy at home, inside the supply chains that actually matter. Rare earths, critical minerals, industrial magnets, specialty chemicals, and the thousands of hidden components that sit between chip design and chip production. And here's the first reality you have to accept. Chips are not the beginning of the supply chain. Chips are the final product of a long materials pipeline. Silicon is only one layer. The real system is a ladder: mining, refining, chemical processing, high-purity materials, precision machinery, specialty gases, wafers, photomasks, packaging, test equipment, and a web of upstream inputs so complex that even a small restriction can stop entire lines. This is why rare earths matter so much. Not because the name sounds exotic, but because they're embedded everywhere in modern power. High-performance magnets for motors, guidance systems, aerospace actuators, wind turbines, robotics, consumer electronics, advanced manufacturing tools, and defense platforms. And here's the uncomfortable part for Washington. The bottleneck is often not the raw ore. The bottleneck is processing, separation, refining, and the industrial ecosystem that turns mined material into usable components at scale. That industrial ecosystem is where China has spent decades building dominance. So when we say China can cut rare earth supply, people imagine a dramatic announcement. Exports banned overnight, everything stops. Panic in the West. But that's not how a smart retaliation works. A smart retaliation is gradual, plausible, and deniable. It's death by paperwork. It's licensing delays. It's environmental inspections. It's customs holds. It's tightening quality standards. It's restricting specific downstream products rather than raw materials so China can say, "We're not weaponizing resources, we're just regulating exports." And the effect can be the same, because modern manufacturing doesn't collapse from one big hit. It collapses from repeated small frictions that compound. A factory can survive a one-week delay. It can't survive uncertainty every week, forever. Once uncertainty enters the system, companies start hoarding inventory. Suppliers raise prices, contracts get rewritten, and the entire cost structure shifts upward. That's how supply shock becomes inflation. Now connect it to the timing problem. If America escalates the oil squeeze, China's incentive to retaliate rises. But the U.S. economy is already vulnerable to any shock that pushes costs higher, because higher costs are politically toxic. People feel it immediately at the pump, at the grocery store, in rent, in shipping, in everything. And businesses feel it as shrinking margins and tougher credit conditions. So China's retaliation doesn't need to crash America to hurt America. It just needs to increase pressure at the worst possible time, when U.S. inflation is sensitive, when rates are high, and when the economy is running with less tolerance for disruption. This is where the 2026 recession risk enters the story. A lot of people talk about recession like it's caused by one event. A bank fails, a war starts, a bubble pops. But most downturns are really a chain reaction. Tighter financial conditions meet a real economy shock. And a supply chain shock is the kind of real economy shock that can hit fast, because companies don't have years to adjust. They have weeks, sometimes days. Imagine the scenario. Beijing tightens rare earth and component exports in targeted categories: magnets, processed materials, specialty chemicals, or critical subcomponents tied to industrial equipment. American manufacturers start bidding against each other for supply. Prices rise. Lead times stretch. Production schedules get rewritten. Some lines slow down. Some orders get missed. Revenue projections fall. Hiring freezes start. Then layoffs begin. At the same time, the consumer side gets hit from the other direction. If oil disruption lifts energy prices, transport costs rise, and that gets passed through into goods prices. So you get a double squeeze: higher input prices and weaker output. That is how you get stagflation pressure: growth down, prices up. And once stagflation pressure appears, the Federal Reserve is cornered, because rate cuts become risky when inflation is rising. But holding rates high becomes dangerous when unemployment starts moving up. In that environment, the Fed is forced into the worst possible posture: higher for longer, even as the economy slows, because it cannot credibly declare victory on inflation. And that's where recession risk stops being a market rumor and becomes a policy dilemma. Now zoom out again. The real danger isn't that America can't make chips. America can. The danger is that the U.S. system is optimized for efficiency, not resilience. It runs on just-in-time logistics, global sourcing, and the assumption that inputs are available if you pay the price. But in a geopolitical supply war, sometimes the input isn't available at any price, at least not in the time window your factory needs. Resilience takes years. War moves in weeks. This is why the oil squeeze strategy is so explosive. If Washington turns energy supply into a battlefield, Beijing will turn industrial inputs into a battlefield. And once both sides weaponize the upstream foundations of production, you're no longer in a trade dispute. You're in a systems war. Now here's the part that makes this even more dangerous. Both sides have incentives to escalate without admitting they're escalating. The U.S. can say, we're enforcing sanctions, protecting stability, defending democracy. China can say, we're protecting national resources, ensuring environmental standards, preventing smuggling. Each action is framed as defensive. Each action is deniable. But the outcome is still escalation. And escalation has momentum. Once companies and markets believe the supply war is real, they begin acting as if the future will be worse. That changes behavior. Companies build buffer inventory. Governments stockpile. Buyers rush purchases. Sellers raise prices. Investors demand higher risk premiums. That is how the expectation of shortage becomes a shortage. Psychology becomes economics. Then politics becomes gasoline. Because when prices rise and jobs weaken, governments get pressured to do something. That something often becomes more tariffs, more restrictions, more sanctions, more retaliation, and the spiral tightens. This is how global supply chains fracture. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in a slow conversion from one world market into rival blocs that no longer trust each other. And if that fracture accelerates, the cost of everything rises. Not temporarily. Structurally, because globalization was a deflation machine. It pushed production to the lowest cost nodes, squeezed margins, and kept goods cheap. Once you reverse that, you reverse the deflation. You get a world where redundancy replaces efficiency, where national security replaces cost optimization, and where supply chains become shorter but more expensive. That's the hidden price of this conflict. Now here's the key strategic question. Which side can absorb the pain longer? America has one advantage: alliances, high-end innovation, capital depth, and a consumer market that still matters. China has another advantage: scale manufacturing, control of processing capacity, and the ability to coordinate industrial policy with fewer political constraints. But both have weaknesses. America is politically sensitive to inflation. A visible rise in energy and consumer prices creates instant pressure. China is sensitive to employment and social stability. Export demand and factory activity matter directly to internal stability. Both systems fear economic pain, but they fear different kinds of pain. That means both will try to push pain onto the other side while insulating themselves. And that is what makes 2026 dangerous, because the actions that protect one system can destabilize the other. So by the time you get to 2026, the world isn't just watching isolated crises in Venezuela or Iran. It's watching a contest over the cost structure of modern power. Oil is the fuel that makes the industrial machine run cheaply. Rare earths and components are the needles that can puncture the machine from the inside. And once both are weaponized, you get the exact environment where a slowdown can turn into a recession. Tighter credit, higher input costs, disrupted production, weaker hiring, and rising political pressure. And the loop has only one direction: escalation. Here's the escalation ladder most people won't see until it's already too late. Step 1 is what we've already entered: targeted disruption. The U.S. increases pressure on discounted crude flows through seizures, interdiction, secondary sanctions pressure, and making logistics riskier. China responds with regulatory tightening on the upstream inputs the West depends on. Licenses, inspections, export controls that look technical but function strategic. Step 2 is fragmentation. Companies stop assuming the global market is neutral. They start building parallel supply chains, not because they want to, but because they have to. You get China supply chains and non-China supply chains. You get stockpiling. You get redundancy. You get higher costs permanently because redundancy is never cheap. Step 3 is price regime change. When supply chains fracture, you don't just get a one-time inflation spike. You get a new baseline. A world where goods are structurally more expensive because the system is less efficient. Globalization was a deflation engine. Deglobalization is the reverse. And step 4 is political blowback. The moment that new baseline shows up in living standards, rent, fuel, groceries, jobs, politics stops being background noise and becomes an accelerant. Governments don't get rewarded for patience. They get punished for pain. And when pressure rises, leaders choose moves that look strong, even if they're economically stupid. That is how economic conflict turns into real-world instability. Now, the reason 2026 becomes the danger zone is timing. If you create supply stress while interest rates are already high and global demand is already uneven, you reduce the system's shock absorption. You remove the cushion. You make small disruptions feel like big ones. So what does this look like in the real economy? It starts with invisible bottlenecks. A magnet plant in one country can't get a processed input on time. A motor manufacturer misses a delivery window. An aerospace supplier slips a schedule. A semiconductor packaging line pauses because one chemical or one specialty component is delayed. These aren't dramatic events. They're operational, but they spread. And once delays spread, the behavior of the entire system changes. Companies overorder, buyers hoard, suppliers raise prices just in case. Inventory costs rise. Working capital gets tied up. That forces companies to tighten spending. Hiring slows, then hiring freezes, then cuts. This is how supply war becomes unemployment. At the same time, inflation doesn't need to explode to become politically lethal. It just needs to stop falling. If input costs rise while demand weakens, you get the worst combination. Margin compression plus sticky prices. Consumers feel poorer, businesses feel squeezed, and central banks lose room to maneuver. That's the macro trap. Because if inflation stays sticky, the Fed can't cut aggressively without risking credibility. But if growth slows and the Fed holds rates high, the slowdown can deepen. That is exactly how a soft landing turns into a hard one. Not from one big crash, but from policy paralysis in the face of conflicting signals. So the key question is not, will there be a recession? The key question is, does the supply war make the recession more likely by removing policy options? And the answer is yes, because supply shocks are the one kind of shock monetary policy can't fix quickly. You can't rate cut your way into new rare earth processing capacity. You can't print your way into refinery output. You can't stimulus your way into instant resilience. Resilience is built in years. Escalation happens in weeks. Now let's talk about what markets and smart operators will actually watch, because they won't wait for politicians to admit what's happening. The first signal is energy risk premium. Not just oil price, but the shape of the curve and how quickly risk reprices around specific routes and sanctioned barrels. When traders start treating discounted supply as unstable, you'll see volatility rise even before physical flows collapse. The market is a forward-looking sensor. The second signal is freight and insurance behavior. When insurers and shippers quietly pull back from certain routes, the cost of moving gray barrels rises. That doesn't need to be announced. You'll see it in logistics constraints, rerouting, longer shipping times, and a widening gap between paper supply and deliverable supply. The third signal is export control granularity. China doesn't need to ban everything. The more selective the restrictions, the more strategic they are. If you see controls aimed at processed materials, magnets, specialty chemicals, or specific categories tied to defense and advanced manufacturing, you're looking at targeted pain, not symbolic politics. The fourth signal is inventory behavior inside manufacturing. This is the most important and least visible. When companies start hoarding inputs, it shows up as rising inventories and longer lead times. That's when you know executives believe the supply war is structural. And the fifth signal is credit stress. Supply war inflation hits margins. High rates hit refinancing. Those two together create a squeeze. Watch defaults, watch spreads, watch layoffs in cyclical sectors. The recession doesn't arrive as one headline. It arrives as the slow failure of weak balance sheets. Now here's the part that changes everything. Escalation doesn't require either side to want a wider conflict. It can happen automatically because each move creates incentives for the next. If the U.S. increases pressure on oil flows, Beijing has to respond, or it looks weak and it invites more pressure. If Beijing responds by tightening rare earths or components, Washington has to counter, or it looks vulnerable and dependent. So each side becomes trapped by credibility, and credibility is expensive. This is why system wars are so hard to stop. They are not fought for one territory or one treaty. They are fought for the foundations of power, cost structures, industrial capacity, monetary plumbing, and control over the inputs that make modern life possible. That also means the end game is not a peace deal. The end game is a new equilibrium, a world where supply chains are divided, where trade is conditional, where energy flows are politicized, where strategic materials are guarded like weapons, and where national security logic shapes corporate decisions. And that new equilibrium is more costly. The hidden truth is simple. Efficiency is fragile. Resilience costs money. So if this conflict continues, the world pays an ongoing tax. Not a tax collected by governments, but a tax paid in higher prices, slower growth, and weaker living standards relative to the world we got used to. Now let's bring it back to the central narrative of this video. The U.S. move, whether you frame it as sanctions enforcement, regime pressure, or strategic disruption, aims at one thing: depriving China of cheap, stable energy inputs that keep its industrial machine unbeatable. If China loses discounted supply and faces higher energy uncertainty, its export engine becomes less ruthless. The margin advantage shrinks. The global pricing power weakens. China's counter, whether you frame it as resource protection or export regulation, aims at one thing: reminding the U.S. that high-tech power still depends on physical inputs, and that Beijing controls critical choke points in processing and industrial ecosystems. That is the collision: oil versus materials, energy versus components, logistics versus inputs. And sitting in the middle of this collision is the 2026 economy, caught between higher costs, tighter credit, and a political climate that rewards escalation more than compromise. So what happens next? There are three paths. Path 1 is managed escalation. Both sides push, but they avoid breaking the system. They keep the pain calibrated, enough to signal strength, not enough to cause collapse. This is the most rational path, but rationality is fragile when politics gets involved. Path 2 is miscalculation. One side pushes too hard, seizes too much, restricts too much, humiliates too publicly, and the other responds with an action that triggers a real shock. Energy spikes, inputs freeze, markets panic, then policy follows panic. Path 3 is structural decoupling. Not a crisis, but a divorce. A slow separation that turns the global economy into blocks. It's quieter than war, but it changes everything. and it makes the world poorer than it could have been, because duplication replaces efficiency. If you want the uncomfortable conclusion, it's this. This isn't about Venezuela. It isn't about Iran. It isn't even about Trump. It's about the fact that in the modern world, the most powerful weapon is not a missile. It's a choke point. And once choke points become weapons, every country starts building its economy like a fortress. That's why the next phase won't look like a traditional war. But it can still wreck living standards. It can still drive inflation. It can still create unemployment. And it can still push the global system into a recessionary shock, especially if 2026 becomes the year where supply war collides with high rates and political escalation. So the question for viewers is not who is right. The question is, can the world handle a power struggle where both sides are willing to break the plumbing of modern life just to prove a point? Because if the answer is no, then the real fight isn't coming. It's already here. It spreads into prices, into jobs, into interest rates, and into recession risk.